Okay, good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome, great. Well, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Allie Effler, and I have the privilege of welcoming all of you to the first session of the Sustaining Our World lecture series presented by Dana. It is the first session of 2023, and we couldn't be more thrilled by the panelists that we have here for you today. This speaker series is now in its second year, and each year it includes 4 sessions that are free and open to the public. They're all focused on topics that are related to the significance of Northwest Ohio's natural resources, the importance of protecting and restoring our ecosystems, and the ways that our community, all of you and all of us, can make a positive difference in the future of our environment. Our goal here is to inform and inspire thoughtful dialogue, and hopefully to inspire each of us to think about how we might contribute to making our future a little bit brighter and a little bit greener. So a little bit about Metroparks that I think most of you probably already know, but it's worth stating we now steward over 12,000 acres in Lucas County, 200 miles of trails, and 19 parks across the entire county. Just a few years ago, we opened Manhattan Marsh, which completed our promise. Yeah, a few people that have been there? Okay, good. That completed our promise to have a park within 5 miles of every resident in Lucas County, and we're really, really proud to be able to say that. Yeah. So together, we are now pursuing, a bigger vision for our community to really elevate our entire region, to build a more vibrant, sustainable, and equitable future, both for our human and our natural resources. And that's a lot about what today is all about, and a lot about what you see here at the Glass City Metropark and Riverwalk. How many of you have never been to this facility before? How many are first-time visitors? Okay, good, excellent, well, welcome. You are in the first phase of our newest Metropark, the Glass City Metropark, which is part of a much bigger vision for the Glass City Riverwalk. It is actually built on a former brownfield industrial site, right? So this is converted land that will take many years to really come to full fruition as a Metropark, but you're seeing the beginnings now. Upon completion, the Glass City Riverwalk will bring not only playscapes, trails, and water access, but it also will add natural areas to the urban landscape. It will help our community to reduce heat and air pollution. It will help filter runoff into the Maumee River, which is so important, and overall create enhancements for our community across this 5 miles. We'll have 300 acres of green space, as I mentioned, 5 miles of trails from bridge to bridge, and then an additional 3 miles on this site alone. And we will really focus on connecting all of the neighbors that surround this area to the Metropark. So again, everyone in our community can experience clean, safe, and natural space. Phase 2 of the Glass City Metropark, which is just beyond us this way, is scheduled to open later this spring, so keep your eyes peeled for some announcements about some June activities. It will be something unlike anything else we have in our community, and we can't wait to share it with you. After that opens, actually, while it's being opened right now, we are also underway for the next phase of the Riverwalk, which is a piece of International Park that you can see as you come over the bridge that is currently under construction, and on the other side of the river, the next section of the Riverwalk. All of that is funded through a Department of Transportation grant, and you'll continue to see progress as we move along the Riverwalk. As I mentioned, the Glass City Metropark and Riverwalk is a truly transformational initiative, and it's made possible by the voters of Lucas County, as well as a community of public, private, and philanthropic supporters. And we are so grateful to have Dana Incorporated as one of our very lead philanthropic donors for this project. Can we please give them a round of applause? The support from Dana, as well as others, will not only help with construction and maintenance of the Glass City Metropark and Riverwalk. The Dana support also sponsors this annual lecture series each year, as well as volunteer cleanup days, and there's one coming up just before Earth Day that you can help with, twice a year, each year, going forward. I want to thank and acknowledge again our Dana partners and those that are here with us today, and then I want to welcome Jeff Cole, who is the Senior Director of Corporate Communications for Dana, to join us at the podium tonight.
Thanks, Sally. The slide says thank you, and that's why I'm here, is to thank all of you for being here. When we we started this in the vision of the Metroparks to put on this Sustaining Our World lecture series. I wasn't sure we'd get the embrace that we've had from the community, and so thank all of you for making this such a success. I think we had to cut off registration this evening. I know there's a lot of people watching online, so thank all of you for making this such a success, and we look forward to many of these in the future. I won't speak at all of these, but I did want to kick off the second season. And along with the thank yous, I want to thank the Metroparks, obviously, and the Metroparks Foundation for all that they're doing for the community and making this facility available to us, and also to thank our panelists. This is really going to be a fantastic discussion. And so I'll just give you a quick update from Dana. Great, challenging time to be in the mobility industry, but also great time to be at Dana. We're making great strides in our sustainability objectives, and if you follow that kind of thing, we've pledged to be net zero by 2040, and we've accelerated our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emission reduction targets to 75% by 2035. So exciting stuff going on there. It's not every company can work in a sustainable manner and manufacture or produce what they produce in a sustainable manner. Not every company is producing products that are also sustainable. So as we've transitioned, we're not the Dana that your grandparents might have known. We're making electric motors in Maumee, Ohio for vehicles. A lot of people don't realize that. So we've really moved into the electric vehicle space. 65% of our new business going forward is for electric vehicles. So we're really excited to be embracing both sides of sustainability, doing it the right way, and then making products that make a difference. So anyway, that's the Dana update, and without further ado, I'll turn it back to Allie. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I think that's a really great testament to the type of partnerships that we seek as a Metroparks community, and just couldn't think of a better partner than Dana to have with us for this series. So getting to the series, we're really thrilled to present tonight's topic, bird migration and conservation, by providing both global perspectives and local implications, and then also hopefully leaving you all with a few things that you can take home with you that might make an impact for the health of our birds here in Northwest Ohio and beyond. I do want to add special thanks to Jeff from the Toledo Zoo and Kimberly from the Black Swamp Bird Observatory. I think we will all agree that we've assembled a world-class panel right here in Northwest Ohio, and we're all so lucky to have all three of you with us here tonight. So with that, I'll introduce Scott Carpenter, who's our moderator for tonight.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody here with us and the millions watching at home. Thank you for spending part of this gorgeous day with us here at Glass City. Over 25 years ago, while I was researching a travel book about Lake Erie, I visited Leamington, Ontario for the first time. Leamington's not a small town, really. It's a little bigger than our suburb here of Oregon. It's in the Canadian South, where you might see tobacco hanging in the fields to dry, and it's the tomato capital of Canada. But Leamington's other claim to fame is that it's home to Point Pelee National Park, a major migratory stopover with more than 300 species of birds. They have an annual festival of birds that draws thousands of birders. So two things that I took away from my first visit to Leamington that stuck with me. The giant tomato in the middle of town that they use for their tourist information booth, and maybe more on point, banners lining the street on light poles that said, "Welcome birders." It was 25 years ago. So I wondered then, and I think I might have written more than a few newspaper columns about this, why not here? We have the birds, the same birds, and earlier. We don't have a big tomato, but we do have a lot of other things to offer tourists, including all of the amenities of Toledo, Port Clinton, and everything in between. What we didn't have was the know-how and the drive, that spark, to put our region on the map as an international birding destination. The Black Swamp Bird Observatory, and specifically one of our speakers tonight, Kim, was that spark. Today, not only does my hometown of Oregon, Ohio have banners that say welcome birders, but the biggest week in American birding has far exceeded any notions I had of what birding could mean for our region. People are now proud to be here, to be the birding capital in May. And the whole community seems to have embraced our birds and the people who come to enjoy them. I know we're not here to talk about tourism specifically, but at Metroparks, we believe that one of the greatest conservation tools is engaging people in nature. Because when we experience nature, most of us enjoy it. It makes us feel good. It affects us at a deep level. And the way we look at it, that's the first step toward creating a conservationist. And I think that's also something that each of our speakers has in common tonight. They represent organizations that connect people with nature locally and around the globe, inspiring them to enjoy, care for, and we hope take action to preserve our natural world. Our speakers tonight are Kimberly Kaufman from Black Swamp Bird Observatory, Jay Wright from Metroparks, and Jeff Saylor from the Toledo Zoo, and I will introduce each in more detail before they speak. During each of our opening 15-minute presentations, if you think of questions you'd like to ask the panelists, please write them down and pass them to the end of the row, and somebody will collect them, and we should have plenty of time at the end to ask questions. Let me introduce our first speaker. Jeff Saylor, president and CEO of the Toledo Zoo and Aquarium, has always had a passion for wildlife and the natural world. After completing his graduate work in ecology at the University of Florida, he embarked on his career in the zoo world. He first served as a curator at Miami Metro Zoo, and then the director of city zoos for the Wildlife Conservation Society in New York City. Over the last 10 years, Jeff has led the Toledo Zoo and Aquarium. His focus has been on expanding zoo conservation programs based on a philosophy of demonstrated impact, as well as providing greater access to the zoo for the community at large. Connecting people with the wonder and value of nature and providing actions that everyone can take to create a shared space for wildlife is Jeff's driving interest. His career has taken him to many parts of the world where he has had the privilege of working with such amazing wildlife as tiger sharks, American alligators, Tasmanian devils, and the birds of the South Pacific and Papua New Guinea, among others. In his free time, Jeff naturally enjoys bird watching, painting, and travel. Jeff, I will turn it over to you. I think you might need this.
Well, thank you, Scott. That was great. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today, and it's great to see so many people here interested in birds. This is the place to be in the United States if you like birds. As Scott said, thousands and thousands of people come to the marshes here in the spring to see birds. They spend lots of money in our community, which we all love, and help uplift the whole area. My interest in birds goes back to my childhood. I was basically raised by homing pigeons. My father was a homing pigeon aficionado, and we always had hundreds of homing pigeons at home, and that's where I really got my interest in birds and these, what most people would think are rather common and pedestrian species, but when you actually think about what these avian athletes are able to do, it was spectacular. We had birds that would win races and would fly an average of 60 miles an hour the whole way home from Texas and make it in a day. Just this amazing creature, incredible athletes. And I always wanted to work with birds. I wanted to work in zoos, and I've been able to actually fulfill my life's dream, so I've been very happy about that. But I've also been able to leverage the resources and the institutions that I've been entrusted with to help what I think makes an impact on animals. And with respect to the Toledo Zoo, we look at how we can impact birds and animals in general globally, but from a standpoint of where are we able to make the greatest impact based on leveraging our skills and the things that are unique to us. So I'm not a big believer in let's just give money to this organization or that organization, because we're not really a charity. We are the charity, right? We're supposed to be receiving the money, not handing the money back out. So we look and see how can we partner with different partners around the world to actually impact wildlife and do so in a way that is outsized to the size of the zoo and will be able to affect real change. And as a result, that means we often work with species that you've never heard of before. They really don't need what we can commit to elephants, because there's an entire world of organizations that give to elephant conservation or talk about an animal that doesn't need any more money, pandas. I mean, they get all the money they could possibly want. So I focus on some little known birds. Let's see if I can get this going. Oh, there's the speakers. And if you have a question, here I am. So I'm going to talk about threats to the world's birds on a global level. There is a group known as the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, and they're sort of the global endangered species list. So you've heard about the endangered species list. That's actually a US federal government list. This is the list for the entire world. And as you can see, we have lots of different ways to identify how threatened a bird is. Everything from totally extinct to least concern, which means they're still doing okay. The ones in the middle there are the threatened column. And what's pretty both scary and alarming is that 1 in 8 birds fall in that middle category at some level of threat. Now, depending on who you talk to, there's 10 to 11,000 species of birds. So well over 1,000 species fall into that category, closer to probably 1,500 to 2,000 fall in that middle category. That's not counting the ones that are already extinct in the wild, or the many thousands that have already gone extinct. In the recent history, we've had 40 of them actually become even more endangered from the time they were put on this list. And we currently have 223 species that are critically endangered. We work with some critically endangered species globally with the zoo. In some instances, you're talking about tens of birds left. Not hundreds, not thousands, tens or fewer birds left. What's affecting them? All kinds of things. But I can tell you, a lot of it ties to human use of habitat and resources, whether that's just outright destruction of habitat for agriculture, housing, urbanization, what have you. Introduced species are horrific, be they plants or animals. A lot of the birds that I personally worked with when I was in grad school were affected by rats, dogs, cats and the like on Pacific Islands, where they've just wiped out most of the avifauna that's there. Those are 2 big ones. You also have hunting and trade. Right now, because of people's interest in singing birds, there are thousands of species in Indonesia that are now, that went from being extremely common to now extremely rare in the course of a decade, from people catching them and selling them to be just kept to sing for an aesthetic reason in the home. It's actually pretty surprising how quickly the populations have just been wiped out, to the point where if you've ever used that app, eBird, many of these species, eBird won't even allow to show up publicly on your list, because they don't want the trappers to know where you saw them. So they can't come out and trap that area out. So pretty scary all in all. This is the bird I did my master's on. This is a many-colored fruit dove. They're from central Polynesia. As you can tell, I had a horrible time out in the field, living in places like Fiji and Samoa. You got to pick the right places, right? And this is a bird that's near and dear to my heart for a number of reasons. It belongs to a group of which there's about 50 or 60 species in this genus, and then similar species, there's probably another 100 species. They're very understudied, undervalued, but they're actually the gardeners of the forest. So this little guy eats figs, and he actually polishes the seeds off in his crop, his gizzard, and then will carry them and deposit them all over the South Pacific so that new figs will grow. Now, it's really cool. Figs are an interesting plant. They need a wasp to procreate. And it's this little tiny wasp where the males actually spend their entire life I'm going to get that backwards. The females spend their life inside the fig. They are born and die inside the fig itself, and the males breed with them there. Half the fig seeds turn into, are actually impregnated with the wasp larvae, and the other half of the seeds actually have the fig embryos in them. So this dove carries the fig and the wasp all over the South Pacific. Now, when I say all over the South Pacific, I mean all over the South Pacific. So I told you about those homing pigeons flying 60 miles an hour. These little birds will travel between Fiji and Samoa, or between Tonga and Samoa, hundreds of miles of open ocean to carry these seeds, to find new fruits. And they're the reason you get forests on newly formed islands after a volcano explodes or a new island raises above the sea. And so they're really important. We focused on those at the zoo because they are so little studied. And if you remember, I talked about that international group called the IUCN. The zoo formed the first specialist group for pigeons and doves worldwide because there wasn't one. Even though this entity has been around for decades, there wasn't one. And we've been able to focus our impacts on this group of highly endangered birds that are also very important to the environment. And like I said, we also focus in areas that we can bring a unique sort of skill set to the table. So the Santa Cruz Islands are these little known specks of land in the Solomon Islands to the east of Australia. And if you're a World War II buff, there were a lot of battles fought in and around the Solomon Islands. And so it's still pretty popular for divers who want to go dive those wrecks. This bird, the Santa Cruz ground dove, used to occur across a huge swath of islands in the Southwest Pacific. But introduced rats, pigs, dogs, what have you, has basically wiped them out everywhere but 3 islands in the Santa Cruz group. Because they're rare, people who collect birds, and specifically pigeons and doves, wanted these animals. And so I think it was in 2018, a very wealthy gentleman from the Middle East contracted local trappers, and he collected 85% of the birds that were left on one island. They got it to the airport in the capital of the Solomons, and they were intercepted. But the problem is here they are sitting in a crate. And they've been sitting in the crate for a while, so they can't just go back to these islands. There's not even an easy way for them to go back to these islands. So a whole group of international zoos came together, sent people over to actually triage the birds, get them set up, and was hoping to get them back to the island when the volcano on the island erupted and wiped out most of the habitat. This is a situation where, because we have the resources and the ability to put people into the field to do the work, we were able to step in and build a facility for these birds and get them stabilized. We're now working on how we get them back into the wild. At the same time, we've kept a small subset as an assurance population that are now in Singapore. We actually have none of these at the zoo. There's no reason to ever bring them to Toledo. The whole point is to get them back onto these islands, and if we bring them here, they're exposed to all kinds of diseases and parasites and stuff they may never have been exposed to there. So we don't want them here. We've got birds we can talk about and raise money and support for this. So we realize this is going to be a bit of a long haul situation because we've got to now find an island that has habitat. We have to find one that's devoid of introduced species to get them back into the wild. And so we also can't be there forever. So we were able to partner with one of the world's largest sustainable palm oil companies, where they actually worry about the damage they're doing in creating palm oil. They actually bring a lot of sustainable activities to the table, and they were able to give us a piece of land to build a recovery center for these birds in the Solomons. Now we're working with them to actually employ locals and train them in how to care for these birds so that eventually it'll be the Solomon Island people that are caring for these animals and getting them back into the wild. We're just acting as trustees at the moment for the Solomon Island government to do that. We've been very successful keeping the birds healthy and happy. That's the first chick ever hatched in the world in captivity with this species, and it was done so at our facility in the Solomons. Gentleman Joe Wood works for us at the Toledo Zoo, and he handles all of our foreign conservation activities, and he's done a great job just dedicated to saving this little bird. Springboarding from what we were doing with the Santa Cruz ground dove, we found another species that was also had some very unique need. This is a Negros Island bleeding heart dove from the Philippines. So this is one of those critically endangered species where there's likely less than 12 wild birds left. Most of the islands they're from in the central Philippines have just been denuded. There's nothing left, less than 1% of the natural habitats left on those islands. We found a nonprofit there that had been working with a small group of these birds they had kept in captivity there on in the primary habitat region for years. They wanted to get them back out into the wild, but they were having trouble both gaining support, exposing people to why this is a good thing, encouraging outreach, and what have you. This was a situation where they really didn't need us to come in and teach them anything. They had about 100 of these birds in captivity. They were quite good at it. What they didn't have was our ability to speak to the public and communicate and develop a way to tell their stories. So this is a very unique conservation program where we actually sent our videographer there and developed a whole series of promotional materials for them to use as outreach within their community and with the global donor groups to be able to raise more money to support these birds. They had a strategy meeting there that we were able to pull pieces of that into the video vignettes that we did for them. And we were able to give them this stuff that they can now use to promote themselves. So once again, a very unique way for the Toledo Zoo to help with endangered species. And just this last week, they released 4 of these birds back into the wild, into a protected area where they've made sure the habitat's nice. There aren't any birds there. And so it's an opportunity to finally get these animals back where they belong. Always looking for other interesting ways that we can help. These are some really cool pheasant species from Nepal. So some of these birds, like this one here, is the cheer pheasant, and that's a Himalayan manal up there in the top, and this is a satyr tragopan. They all live well above 12,000 feet during the summer. So places where it'd be hard for you and I to even, walk across the street without getting winded. At the same time, the human populations where they live are basically living a subsistence lifestyle. If they want to cook dinner, they have to go out into the forest and gather up limbs and tree bits of trees and wood and what have you to burn. They're also looking for any protein they can find, and these taste pretty good. So they will often hunt them wherever that's possible. But at the same time, Nepal is seeing a huge upswing in tourism for people not only wanting to climb Mount Everest and basically just do hiking and mountain climbing, but also to see its wildlife. So we were able to support a group there that was going out and actually surveying for these animals to see where they were, to designate areas that could be turned into protected regions for them. But interestingly enough, the overriding challenge was the guides and the rangers in this area. There was no field guide to these birds in the Nepalese language. English isn't widely spoken, and here they have this incredible resource and no way to tell people about it. So in this situation, we stepped in and published this book in Nepali. And so this is a joint publication between the Toledo Zoo and I believe it's Helm Field Guides, which often you'll see even if you're going overseas, you might pick out one of these field guides if you're going to Colombia or South Africa or what have you. But I mean, think about that. We take for granted, even the books we have that we can use to teach our children and teach others what's so great about birds. And this is a very simple thing. I think this cost us $7,000 to generate enough of these field guides to give away to all the rangers and all the guides in Nepal. That's not a lot of money when you're thinking about making a big impact, but it's something where we can help out and have a big effect. And then finally, because we're always looking at how we can find some of these really critically endangered species and do whatever we can to give them the resources to begin to recover. This is a very interesting animal from Samoa. It's called a Toothbuilt Pigeon. And the reason there's 3 dead ones up here is that's the only recent photo of one. And I can't show you what the bird even looks like from that photo, right? So their scientific name basically means little dodo. They actually look like a little version of the dodo that went extinct in the 1600s. They're only found in Samoa. They were wiped out by pigs and rats, and we actually thought they were extinct. But we just funded a field survey there, and our employee that works there with the Santa Cruz Ground Dove went in and actually found one of these birds in a volcanic crater in Samoa. And we're now convening all the partners in the region to do a thorough, exhaustive survey of the Samoan Islands to find where these birds are. And then, like with the Santa Cruz Ground Dove, we will be building a facility in Samoa to take the last of these birds in and to breed them in captivity, but in Samoa, so that we can put them back out into the wild. One of the ways we do this, so we don't actually completely extirpate the animal in its natural habitat, is we'll actually find where they lay their eggs. And we'll get the eggs from these nests because there's not a very high survival rate. Then bring them back to our aviaries, hand raise those birds, sometimes using puppets so they won't actually be imprinted on people. And that'll help us build a nucleus of animals in captivity that we can then breed to get back in the wild. The great thing about pigeons and doves is everything eats them. So when it comes to what they've done as an evolutionary thing for defense, they can recycle breeding-wise almost instantaneously. So if you take an egg from one, within 10 days they've laid another egg. So in effect, you can double production and actually increase the numbers of surviving chicks, which is kind of cool. We're doing this now with another little species in Brazil, but I'm not allowed to talk about it because the Brazilian government hasn't released it yet. But it's tried and true process for making sure that you're not completely taking the animals out of the wild. You still have some of them out there, so there's a reason to protect the habitat. But I'm hoping in a year we'll know where the remainder of these birds are, and we're well on our way to increasing their numbers again. It's amazing the number of wildlife we've lost. Many things you've never even heard of. When I was doing my grad work in Polynesia, my advisor was actually a zooarchaeologist. He was studying these birds that had gone extinct on oceanic islands. And we would dig down in the old kitchen sites of villages. And you'd get down about 6 feet, and all of a sudden you'd hit just an amazing variety of bird bones. And you could see where the locals had come to the island and within 100 years had wiped out just about every species on the island. So we talk about what we have to save today, but just within the Pacific alone, over 3,000 species of bird went extinct when man first colonized those islands. And so now, to me, it's so important to save what little is left and to make an effort with a bird like this. And this is a situation where an institution like the zoo that's been around for 123 years can do that. We have the staying power that once we start funding one of these projects, we can do it all the way to the end. So that's all great. You can help with these programs by supporting the zoo, but I'll tell you, these global programs only make up about 20% of what we do for conservation at the Toledo Zoo. And the reason for that is if you really want to have an impact on conservation, whether it be birds, hellbenders, sturgeon, you name it, butterflies, you need to do it locally, where you can actually give your constituency, your community, options for what they can do as activities to actually make a meaningful impact on wildlife. And that's why we started our Wild Toledo program, which has one of the largest native plant nurseries now in the United States. We grow over 400 species of plants at the zoo that are all native to Northwest Ohio. And we work with schools, local governments, corporations to turn lawns and vacant lots back into native habitat. And if you want to save a bird, plant a native plant. There are tons of native species that will do just fine in your gardens. And they'll give you the color you want, and they'll give you the berries you want, or they're going to be really tough when it comes to disease and bugs because they've adapted to this region. But what they are going to do is they're going to ensure that birds have a place to live and a place to eat. And right now we are managing close to 100 of these restored spots throughout Toledo and the greater Toledo area. And we've expanded into other states, working with Dana, the same partner here. We're now working with them at one of their plants in Tennessee. turning lawns back into native habitat. So if you want to do something for birds, I'd encourage every last one of you to plant a native plant this summer. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Our next speaker is Jay Wright, Director of Conservation Science here at Metroparks Toledo. Jay has been involved in bird research and conservation for 13 years and has worked on projects across the world, including both polar regions and on 4 continents. Some of his favorite conservation experiences include monitoring nesting success and predation of endangered seabirds in Kauai, comparing nest success of shorebirds between developed oil fields and pristine areas of the Arctic tundra, and investigating competition between migrant and resident warblers on the non-breeding grounds in Jamaica. He has the same travel agent as Jeff, I think. In 2015, Jay moved to Ohio for graduate school and has been living and working in the state since then. He recently completed his PhD at Ohio State University, studying the acorn-catching behavior of blue jays, and has led research in Northwest Ohio on the migration ecology of rusty blackbirds here in the Lake Erie marshes and eastern whippoorwills in the oak openings. Since joining Metroparks last May, Jay has begun a district-wide non-breeding bird monitoring program and will be kicking off a similar breeding bird survey effort this spring to help drive habitat management decisions for birds of conservation concern. And Jeff, or Jay?
Thank you, Scott. Make sure I know how to use this. Cool. All right, thanks everybody for coming. I'm really excited to be here to talk about birds. I'm assuming there's a lot of bird lovers in the audience here. So whereas Jeff was really focusing on the global extinction crisis and critically endangered species, I'm going to be talking more about problems here in North America and Ohio specifically, and really talking about overall and widespread declines in the abundance of birds. So not necessarily really critically endangered species, but just ongoing, really devastating declines that we're seeing. So I'm going to start with a really depressing statistic from a 2019 paper that we've lost 3 billion birds since 1970. And that sounds like a lot of birds, and it is a lot of birds. It's about 30% of what our 1970 abundance was here in North America we've lost in the last 50 years. And so this paper really kind of explains in a lot of detail and breaks it down why we're losing some groups and not others. I'm just going to point out a couple of things here with these figures, mainly just focusing on, I guess that doesn't work, focusing on that panel C. That's really just breaking down these declines, so all of these billions of birds that we've lost, by the dominant biomes, and so the dominant habitat types that they're using. And I just want to point out, so really the worst off are grassland bird species. So if you look at the bottom of that bar chart figure, we've lost over 50% of grassland bird abundance in the last 50 years. And of course, we're losing birds from just about all of our habitats. The silver lining here is that if you look at the top, in the blue bar, wetland bird species abundance has actually increased over the last 50 years. And there's a little bit more to that story, so don't get too excited yet, because there's not all good news. But there is evidence that conservation and legislation works, so environmental movements, they work. Also not pictured here is the really great success of raptors or birds of prey. So after DDT and some other dangerous chemicals were banned in the 1970s, there's been a huge growth in raptor populations. They've increased over 200%. So this kind of stuff does work, and if we act, we can reverse some of these declines. But I'm going to talk about some of the main causes or the main drivers of these widespread declines. So of course the biggest one is habitat loss. If you just look outside in Northwest Ohio, almost everything's agriculture, and that used to be forest, used to be grasslands, and that's the case across much of the US. Interestingly though, we actually haven't had a lot of spread of agriculture in the last 50 years. So most of the land that was cleared for agriculture was actually done before the 1970s, Instead, what we're really seeing is a combination of factors that kind of fall under the term of agricultural intensification. So one of these, there's a lot that goes along with this involving soil health and water quality. I'm just going to talk about a couple of things that really impact birds directly. One of these is farm size. So we used to actually have more farms and smaller farms, and that was good because there was a little bit of heterogeneity in the landscape. A lot of farms might have had, they didn't specialize necessarily in one thing. So they might have had livestock, they might have had a few different crops, but we've lost some of these small farms as bigger companies have bought up land. So we have a lot of single crop production and just really big fields and big farms. So we lost some of those kind of marginal habitats that used to support some species. We're also seeing a much greater use of pesticide use and chemical inputs. There are a few, I won't get into the names of them, but there are a few pesticides that are really harmful. They can cause direct mortality to birds if they ingest any of those seeds. They're really causing insect populations to collapse. So there's a lot of factors that are associated with agriculture that are causing bird declines. Another big thing is the spread and sprawl of urbanization. So this actually has increased in the last 50 years. So by about 30%, there's more urban area. And that, along with agriculture, has really contributed to habitat fragmentation. And if you look at that photo, that's an aerial photo on the top right of Northwest Ohio, just outside of Oregon. And you can kind of see, if you can make it out, what fragmented habitat looks like. So basically we have some little patches of forest, and it's just surrounded by ag, or you might have a different landscape where you have little narrow patches of a golf course or forest, and it's surrounded by neighborhoods and urbanization. So what this means is that all of those little fragments are isolated from one another, and so that really reduces the dispersal potential for young birds between these habitats. It reduces the connectivity, so it's a lot harder for these habitats to support more species and more abundance. Another thing that happens, of course, with all this urbanization is the increase of roads. We have a lot more collisions from not only from cars hitting birds that are either walking or flying across roads, but we also have a lot of increase in light pollution. So I think Kim is going to talk a little bit more about this maybe, but the light pollution in cities especially is a big problem. For migrating birds, it confuses them as they're flying overhead at night. It draws birds in. They often collide with buildings and glass, and so we see a lot more of that with the development of urbanization. The last major factor that I'm going to touch on here, and there are many, many others, is climate change. And so there's a lot that goes along with climate change. I'm just going to talk about a couple of things that we do know is happening, and there's evidence for right now. So the first is that we're going to see, and we are seeing, a lot of range shifts and range restrictions, especially for species that have fairly specialist habitats that they use. So if we look at this figure on the top left and think about mountainous regions, a lot of birds often, they kind of carve out their niche in a certain elevational gradient. And any of those birds that are at the top of the mountains, there's not that many resources up there, but they have their own way of finding food, and there's less competition with other species. So in North America, if you think about rosy finches in New Mexico and the Rockies, if you've ever been out there, this is an example of a species like this. But basically, as the climate warms, we're going to see plant communities and associated wildlife gradually shifting up in elevation, and then those birds that are already at the top of the mountains are just going to get squeezed out, so there's not really anywhere for them to go. Another example of this that's similar is salt marshes and other coastal marshes. So as we see sea level rise, these salt marshes are going to be gradually more and more flooded. If they can, they'll start to migrate inland, the marshes themselves. But of course, most of our coastline is developed. So there's just like a hard line of coast, and there's not really anywhere for these marshes to migrate to. So we'll start to see, and we are seeing, declines in specialist species like seaside sparrows or salt marsh sparrows that really specialize in these habitats. The last climate change impact is called phenological mismatch. And this is something that really only affects migratory birds. And hopefully I can give a succinct explanation of this. So basically, phenology refers to the timing of natural events. And the mismatch here is between spring green up and the associated insect abundance that comes along with it, and then the arrival timing of birds arriving from the wintering grounds in the tropics. So if you think about it, birds have evolved over thousands of years to migrate to the tropics during the winter, and then their timing for leaving the tropics, coming back to the temperate zone to breed, is really dependent on certain things like day length or climate factors in the tropics. But since climate change is causing warming at different rates, we have earlier spring green up here, and that's shifting that timing earlier in the season, but those migrants are not shifting that departure timing. So basically when they arrive back on the breeding grounds, they're going to miss the peak of insect abundance, which they need for raising young. So that's something that is starting to happen for certain species as well. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit more about Ohio and why Ohio is important. These are some more figures from that same paper that had a lot of really great ways to visualize these declines. All I want to pull out here is that in that map, in those red dots, basically we see that Ohio is one of the areas that's experiencing heavy declines during active migration. So this is showing radar stations and how much passage migrants are overhead. And so Ohio being in an area where we have two flyways, the Mississippi and the Atlantic flyway, kind of overlapping here in the state, we have really heavy declines. And this figure here on the left is showing the same thing. So of these four flyways, these four major flyways that we have in North America, the Mississippi and the Atlantic are really experiencing the biggest declines in bird passage migrants. And if we want to put a few more numbers to this, looking at that 3 billion birds lost, 2.5 billion of that is of migratory species. So migrants are really being hit the hardest here. And then also species that overwinter in the temperate zone, in the temperate regions, so regions like Ohio, have lost 1.4 billion. So almost half of that is birds that we have here overwintering in our area. So we do in Northwest Ohio have a high amount of responsibility to act. And especially here, we have three nationally designated important bird areas. So we have the Lake Erie Western Basin, which encompasses the coastal marsh regions. We have the lower Maumee River Corridor and the Oak Openings region. And we get a lot of birds passing through these areas. And if we look at the birds that are experiencing the most losses, these top three groups are ones that we have in really big numbers. So, the most losses we're seeing are from American sparrows, like the American tree sparrow that's pictured up here in the top right. We have those overwintering here. The second group that's losing the most is wood warblers. Of course, everybody knows we're the warbler capital of the world, and we have the biggest week, so we get tons of warblers passing through here. And then the third group is blackbirds. And we have huge flocks of blackbirds in the marsh region and also in the Maumee River corridor. And especially, so as Scott mentioned, I studied rusty blackbirds for my master's. Up here in the marsh region, we have one of the nation's biggest hotspots, if not the biggest. Their stopover habitat or their stopover hotspot here in our marsh region for rusty blackbirds, which are a boreal breeding bird that migrates through Ohio and is really, really heavily declining. All right, so what can we do here and what can individuals do? I'm just going to list off a few things that are always good for anybody to do whenever they can. First, educating and engaging others. So, the people here are probably interested in birds, but I'm sure you all have friends or neighbors that aren't. And so whenever possible, just kind of engaging them, letting them know the extent of the problem that we have and what they can do and what small actions everybody else can do to help. I think it's really important that we support local small farms and eat local foods. So we have some really great local wildlife here that we can eat. So we have the fishing run, the walleye run that's on right now. So eating fish, hunting deer, any of these local sources of protein, and supporting small farms is really important so we're not really relying on these big unsustainable ag operations. As Jeff mentioned, as much as possible, convert your lawns to pollinator gardens. So that lawns don't really have much value. I know they look nice and they're good for recreation, but they don't have a lot of ecological value. So wherever you can, plant native plants. You're going to provide habitat and food resources for birds. Keep your cats indoors is a really big one, and try and convince your neighbors to do that. So after habitat loss, outdoor cats are the biggest killer of birds worldwide, and especially in North America, we have the research to back it up. 2 to 3 billion birds a year are killed by cats, so by outdoor cats. So keep your cats indoors, please. And the last thing, I'm going to talk about just a couple of things that Metroparks does as an organization that has the capacity to do that, and that's creating and enhancing habitat. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of projects that we've done that I think are really impactful. So the first is creating new grasslands. So we saw from the first slide, grassland bird species are declining the most out of all these groups of birds. And whenever we can kind of buy up agriculture and restore it into native habitat, that's a really big win. So one I'm just going to highlight here is Cannonball Prairie Metro Park. Used to be cropland. In 2019, it was restored and seeded with our Blue Creek Seed Nursery into a native prairie. Within 3 years, and even less than that, in the first 2 years, we had almost all of the major grassland specialist species either confirmed breeding in it or at least using it. So that includes Vesper sparrow, Henslow sparrow, grasshopper sparrow, Savannah sparrow. So all these American sparrows that are heavily declining are using Cannonball Prairie. Also some other grassland specialists like eastern meadowlarks and dick sissels. So this is a really big success story, I think. So another really good example of converting agriculture into really great native habitat is Howard Marsh. So that's almost 1,000 acres of wetland. And of course, Howard Marsh Phase 2 just opened this last year, so we're going to start to see a lot more bird use of that. But even in the few years that Howard Marsh Phase 1 has been opened, we have already seen 15, at least, at a minimum, state endangered and state threatened species either breeding or using that marsh, and where there was none before. And so remember from the opening slide, I said that wetland species are increasing. Unfortunately, that's almost all due to increases in ducks and geese. So many other wetland species are really still steadily declining, and a lot of our state endangered and state threatened birds are wetland species. So we still have a lot of work to do with wetlands for multiple reasons. And the last project I'm going to highlight is the recent 230-acre Secor Metro Park expansion. And one of the big goals for this one was to create a matrix of wetlands and prairies and have this kind of wet prairie habitat that's really imperiled in the Oak Openings region. So if you think of Irwin Prairie, if you've been out there, we're kind of going for something like that with this part of the Secor expansion. And already in the first year, even before it was complete, we've had sandhill cranes using it, possibly breeding there. I'm not sure if that's 100%, but there is a chick seen. So sandhill cranes are already using it, and we expect soon to see other wet prairie specialists like Wilson snipe, like sedge wren that use the close Irwin Prairie already, and other wetland species like Sora and Virginia rail we expect to see there very soon. All right, so the last thing I'm going to talk about that Metroparks does that's really crucial for all of this is research and monitoring and how that plays into our adaptive management. So anytime you do restoration or you're managing habitats actively, it's really important to monitor the habitat and the wildlife that's using them so we know that we're making the right decisions with that management and that restoration. So to that end, we've started a non-breeding bird monitoring program that runs year-round just about year-round, from August to May, and that's mostly volunteer-based. And that'll help us kind of determine how birds are using the habitats that we're managing. As Scott mentioned, we'll be starting a breeding bird monitoring program district-wide in all of our parks this year, and again for the same purpose, to see how breeding birds are using our habitats that we're managing. And then wherever possible, it's really important that we have targeted monitoring of certain threatened species. So a couple examples, we've had lark sparrow monitoring going for a long time, and I'm not sure if she's here, but our longtime volunteer Val Horniak has been out there for around 30 years monitoring lark sparrows, and we really appreciate all of her hard work and giving recommendations for lark sparrow habitat. Another example is just coming up actually this Saturday in a few days is the Ohio crane count. So this is something that's coordinated through the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative and the Ohio Division of Wildlife. And we have a network of volunteers that will be going out across Lucas County searching all kinds of areas to find cranes and find the habitats that they're using. So with that, that's pretty much all I have. I just want to say that there are lots of ways that you can help too if you're interested in research and monitoring, especially if you're a birder. So the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has lots of citizen science data sets like Feeder Watch or Nest Watch. Of course, eBird is the easiest and best way to contribute to data that's really used for really good science. So your bird checklists are being used for science if you use eBird for sure. If you really like nightjars, so birds like whippoorwills or common nighthawks, there's a nightjar survey network continent-wide that you can join and do a nightjar monitoring route. Or, of course, you can volunteer with Metroparks. So if you're interested in monitoring nest boxes or tracking bird abundance or anything else, maybe it's not related to birds, we're always happy to have more volunteers. So yeah, that's all I got. Hand it back over to Scott.
Thank you, Jeff. Jay? Our next speaker, Kimberly Kaufman, is the Executive Director of Black Swamp Bird Observatory here in Northwest Ohio. She became the Education Director in 2005 and Executive Director in 2009. As the Education Director, Kimberly played a role in building BSBO's school programs, as well as the highly successful Ohio Young Birders Club. That's a group of teenagers that has served as a model for youth birding programs. Kimberly is also the co-founder of the biggest week in American birding, the largest birding festival in the country. She is a contributing editor to Birds and Blooms magazine and co-author of the Kaufman Field Guides to Nature of New England and Nature of the Midwest. Accolades to her credit include the Chandler Robbins Award given by the American Birding Association to an individual who has made significant contributions to education and/or bird conservation. In 2017, she received a prestigious Milestone Award from the Toledo area YWCA. Kimberly serves on the boards of Shores and Islands, Ohio, and the American Bird Conservancy. She and her husband, Ken, make their home just down the road in Oak Harbor, Ohio. Kimberly.
Thank you so much, Scott. What an honor it is to be here, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you. So many people coming in on a beautiful evening because you love birds, right? You all love birds. If you don't, you're going to by the time you leave here. So you all know that we have the best zoo and the best Metroparks in the entire country, right? We all know that. Well, I feel very strongly that we also have the best bird observatory in the country. So before I talk about spring migration, I want to tell you a little bit more about Black Swamp Bird Observatory, because in addition to hosting the biggest birding festival in the country, the Bird Observatory has been studying songbird migration in this region for more than 30 years at our primary banding research station, believe it or not, located behind the Davis-Bessie nuclear power plant. It's a really interesting marriage between a bird observatory and a nuclear power plant. But the marsh that's behind that power station is the largest area of habitat for migratory birds in the entire region. It's a phenomenal place to study bird migration. And 7 days a week during spring and again in fall, our research staff are out in the marsh working side by side with dedicated volunteers to study migratory birds. We know a lot about the timing of migration, the behavior of migratory birds, and that data contributes to the understanding property owners and land managers about how to manage their properties for migratory birds. And I'm incredibly proud of our school programs. We are bringing students out into the marsh for hands-on bird banding science, working side by side with our research staff. They're collecting data that's contributed to the same database as every other ornithologist in the country. And I'm so proud that we can offer these, especially as a nonprofit, at no charge. We all know that we have got to get kids at some level disconnected from devices and reconnected with birds in the natural world, because they will be the stewards of this habitat into the future. And the way we make those programs free as a nonprofit is through caring people like you, through members and donations and grants. But we are known internationally for being the host of the humbly named biggest week in American birding, but it's a week that lasts 10 days, so it really is the biggest week. This is a 10-day event, and it's right around the corner. That's timed to coincide with the peak of songbird migration through the region so that we can immerse birders who are visiting here in spring migration in a really magical way. We still have a lot of activities left. You can join us for keynotes and van trips, and our world-class Metroparks play a key role in the success of this event. So many of our trips are taking visiting birders from around the world to our Metroparks. And the event completely transforms Northwest Ohio. This is the now iconic boardwalk at McGee Marsh Wildlife Area. And if you've never been there before, McGee Marsh is about halfway between the cities of Oregon and Port Clinton. This is about a mile-long arc of lumber that transects some of the most important habitat for migratory birds on the continent. And that's not hyperbole, that is a true statement. This is what the boardwalk looks like on any given day in July or August. But this is what it looks like when a good bird shows up during May. This is prime real estate if you want to see migratory birds. And what I love so much about this, people call these crowds. These aren't crowds, these are bird snuggles. Even if you're not interested in birds, and you should all be interested in birds, if you just love to people watch, you can go out onto that boardwalk and stand shoulder to shoulder and hear languages being spoken from all over the world. All of these people coming together, unified by their love of birds. It's just the most wonderful thing. And it's not just birders. Photographers from around the world come to this area because the birds during spring migration here are more accessible, more confiding, if you will, than anywhere else in their life cycles. You can see birds better here than you can anywhere else. And part of the reason so many birders are here, not just because there are birds here, but it's because Black Swamp Bird Observatory set out to market this region to birders on a global scale. And there are some really important nuances about what make the birding so special in Ohio. The first thing is that the peak of songbird migration typically, although this is starting to change, comes through the area before the leaf out. So you can see the birds really well. The second most important thing is that it's early enough in the season that there are no biting insects like mosquitoes and flies. And if you've ever birded on the Gulf Coast of Texas in spring, you know that's not the case there. And finally, my favorite thing about migration here is that by the time the birds get to our latitude, the males are singing. It's close enough to the breeding season that not only do you have these spectacularly beautiful birds that are just active and intensely alive, but you have that symphony of song that surrounds you anywhere you go, and it just makes it such a beautiful experience. So for these reasons and so many more than 90,000 bird watchers visit Northwest Ohio in spring just to see the birds as they pass through our area. And to date, we've had visitors from every state, more than 50 countries and 6 continents register for the biggest week. Now, if you know any permanent residents of Antarctica, and you could get them to register for the biggest week, come on, Jeff, use your influence. We'd love to say birders from every continent, but we've got to check that off the list yet. And we're also keenly interested in what these birders, how they contribute to the economy. So we send out a post-event economic impact and travel data survey to all the biggest week attendees, and we haven't analyzed these numbers since 2016, and the event has grown so much since then that certainly this number has grown. But the answer to question 9 of how much they spent while in Ohio on a goose? That's an appropriate slip of the tongue, on food, gas, lodging, and shopping. It's a $40 million economic impact every spring. It really helps us promote the economic value of habitat conservation. It gives Black Swamp Bird Observatory a powerful voice to speak to community leaders and elected officials about the need to enhance and expand habitat anytime that we can. A few more details about spring migration is that all this occurs during what the tourism industry considered the shoulder season. Businesses, small businesses weren't even open along the lake shore. So businesses are opening early, putting people back to work and expanding their staff. Birds are having a significant impact on the quality of life in Northwest Ohio in so many ways, and I love that. But we can't talk about migration in the biggest week without talking about the birds. So more than 300 species of birds have been documented in this region, but it's these, the warblers, that bring people here from all over the world, because everywhere else in the warbler's life cycle, they're dispersed out over wide swaths of habitat on the wintering grounds in Central and South America, on their breeding grounds in Canada and Alaska. But here they're concentrated and they're very accessible. You can see them better than anywhere else. And the next reason is migration, which Jay has touched on. But if humans could fly, we could migrate the way that swans and ducks and waterfowl do, because the adults show the young the way, and they migrate during the day using visible landmarks. So if we could learn to fly, we could migrate that way. It becomes harder to wrap your head around when you think about the way songbirds migrate, because the route is instinctive. The adults do not show the young the way, and they migrate during the night. They're nocturnal migrants, and they migrate using celestial navigation. Isn't that beautiful? They navigate by knowing the star patterns, and they can orient north and south depending on the time of year. So it's a migration as the birds are coming north to their wintering grounds from Central and South America. They're all coming this way. A beautiful feathered parade is on its way. The next thing is Lake Erie. If you are a songbird that weighs less than an ounce and you don't swim and you don't even float, you are very reluctant to cross a large body of water unless you're at your energetic best. You want your gas tank full. So these birds are coming down and seeing the barrier of Lake Erie, dropping down, crossing down through into the habitat to feast on insects. And Jay touched on this, and it's worth repeating that there's great concern. These are little insects called midges. They look a lot like a mayfly, but they're much smaller. They're aquatic insects, and the timing of the massive hatches of these insects times with the peak of songbird migration, but that's changing. So our research is looking at that very closely, but it provides a bonanza for migratory birds for them to feast up, fill up their gas tank before they power on across Lake Erie. The next reason is what we call the funneling effect. And birds migrate on a huge swath coming across the country, but there are three general routes that migratory birds follow as they're coming north in spring. The first is the westerly route, and this is the group of birds that don't want to cross the Gulf of Mexico. It's a daunting barrier, so they skirt it to the west and then come up through the Great Plains. The next is a group that we call the trans-Gulf migrants. These are little birds that are going to leap off the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula and power all the way across the Gulf of Mexico. It's an 18-hour flight on a good day, and these birds weigh less than a ballpoint pen. It's just astonishing what they can do. And the last route to the east brings birds up through the Antilles, across Cuba, up the eastern seaboard. But look what happens right over Northwest Ohio. All three of those routes converge to bring massive numbers of birds through our region and spectacular diversity. So many different kinds of birds in big numbers will be on their way here soon. The next phase of the funneling effect, if you look at this, much of the habitat on the lakeshore that these birds prefer has been developed. It's a lot of agriculture, and you'll see these little spots of green right on the lakeshore. If I can get the pointer to work. Well, you can see them. So the birds are funneled into these last remaining patches of habitat, but what's so special about this, when you look a little closer, is that those are almost all public areas. They give us access for birders, so places like McGee Marsh Wildlife Area, Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, and now the absolutely spectacular Howard Marsh Metro Park. Not only are there birds there, but we can put birders into those places, and they're free. The access is free. So that funneling effect not only brings birds, it brings a lot of birders too. So obviously, spring migration of songbirds is a tremendous asset for Northwest Ohio, but it does come with a responsibility to protect the habitat that these birds rely on and that has such an economic impact on the region. So to address these threats, Black Swamp Bird Observatory for many decades has been working with partners to address the most serious threats. And we talk a lot about habitat loss. And when you think about that, you think about the rainforest or grasslands or protecting the lake. But the habitat we never think about is the air column. Birds spend a majority of their lives, a huge percentage of their lives, in the air. And we have to make sure that the passage is safe, especially as they're coming into areas of what we call stopover habitat, where the birds are dropping down into this habitat. And we're seeing lots of pelicans in the region. I just had to throw this gratuitous pelican image in here, but again, watching pelicans soar, every time I see them soar, I think we have to do what we can to protect the region from things like wind turbines. We all know that we must have renewable energy, sustainable energy, but we have to have the right renewable energy in this region. There are good places for wind turbines, but this isn't one of them. So the kind of energy we can have here is solar on our already developed infrastructure. Every flat building, on a hospital, on a school, on a parking garage, as individuals, we should be demanding from our lawmakers that there are subsidies for residential solar, and we should exploit every one of those opportunities before we ever think of putting tall structures with spinning blades in stopover habitat like this. And Jay talked about building collisions. Tall lighted buildings disorient birds, and they will come in and circle the buildings. Sometimes they'll collide with the buildings. Sometimes they'll circle the buildings disoriented until they fall to the ground. This problem kills more than 1 billion birds a year colliding with tall buildings. So to address that, the Bird Observatory created what we call our Bird Safe, Birder-Friendly Communities Initiative. This is based on the premise that if a city will take steps and show the effort to be bird safe, we can promote that to birders as bird friendly, and we can encourage birders to visit the businesses that in Toledo, since it's a bird safe community. The first thing was phase 1, to get buildings in Toledo enrolled in the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative's Lights Out program. It's a very simple program to diminish upper level lights and lights that point upwards. Those are the problematic lights. It's very simple for buildings to participate, and working with a whole lot of regional partners, including the Lucas County Sustainability Commission. And Mayor Kapsakavich's office has been very supportive as well. I want to give special thanks to Richard Hylant from Hylant Insurance, because Richard has a lot of influence and he uses it to help birds and promote bird conservation. And he got so many buildings enrolled. This is what the skyline of Toledo looks like now during spring and fall migration. You should be very proud of your city. But it's not enough. I want to promote the buildings that are participating, but we need more. And I'm thrilled to be working with Jay and Metroparks to try to enroll more buildings. Again, it's a very simple program to enroll in. So if you know building managers, please send them our way. We'd love to talk to them. And I don't know if Jessica Duez is here tonight. I think her name was on the list, but the Toledo Zoo and Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge are partnering to do a monitoring program. Every morning they're downtown looking for birds that have been injured or have perished by colliding with the buildings. They need volunteers. So please, I'll let that slide up for a few minutes. If you call or just reach out to Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge or to Jeremy Dominguez at the Toledo Zoo, let them know if you're available to go down and help them monitor downtown. The birds that are injured are being taken to Nature's Nursery to be rehabbed and hopefully released. So I think one of the benefits of the Biggest Week is the way it has inspired collaboratives. A lot of regional partners working together to address the threats to birds, to protect this amazing resource that brings so much to Northwest Ohio. And the next phase that Jay talked about is addressing the outdoor cat issue. This is by far the most controversial, polarizing threat to birds that I've worked on in a nearly 30-year career. It's a difficult conversation to have, but we must have it. Over 2 billion birds every year are killed by outdoor cats. And it's not a great life for cats either. I'm a cat lover, and I can't imagine ever letting our cats roam freely. There are tons of catios on the market now, so if your cat must go outside, you can just keep it confined. There's an effort going on working with Metroparks, Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative, the Bird Observatory, and American Bird Conservancy to address this issue right here in the state of Ohio. We would like to see cats treated with the same kind of dignity that we treat dogs, so that we're not just letting cats wander and roam to impact your neighbors and impact birds. So that's a romp through a lot of the things that your regional partners are working on to address threats to birds, but there's a lot that you can do as individuals. Just think, if every person in this room took one simple step to do something for birds, what an impact it would have. And you don't have to lobby Congress, you don't have to be a bird expert to make a difference. Can you believe it can be as simple as the coffee that you choose? Look up bird-friendly coffee. When you get home, you have homework now. Bird-friendly coffee is coffee that's grown the traditional way under the shade of native trees. And those native trees provide habitat for migratory birds on their wintering grounds. It can be as simple as your choice of coffee. Both Jeff and Jay talked about planting native plants, but I would suggest that if there's one thing you can do, it would be to introduce somebody new to birding. Our job at the Bird Observatory, as I think it, at our heart, is to help people fall in love with birds, because people care most about the things they love. And if we can help more people fall in love with birds, that builds more support for habitat conservation. And I just touched on that briefly, but you are the first people in all of Northwest Ohio to receive the Biggest Week Visitors Guide, and we're so proud of this magazine. I brought a whole box here for you guys tonight. If you run out, you can find them on newsstands at restaurants and the libraries in Northwest Ohio. This is an 88-page magazine that the Bird Observatory produces with our partners at the Suburban Press. It's a free publication, it's a beautiful magazine, and it's a reflection of the Bird Observatory's commitment to doing as much good for Northwest Ohio with the voice we've been given by birds, because you'll find the biggest section of real estate in there has nothing to do with the Bird Observatory, nothing to do with the festival, and a lot to do with all the other wonderful things that this region has to offer birders while they're visiting. And there's also a lot of information about conservation. Stories about coffee, you can learn more about that, about cats, so I encourage you to pick some up, and some cool free bird stickers too on your way out. And I'll leave you with this. We talk a lot about the business aspect of birding, about economic development, and we've shared some really sobering thoughts with you tonight. So take this away. We live in a society where I think we develop things to argue about. We can disagree about any number of things. But the one thing I think we can all agree on is that we can never have enough joy in our lives. And that's what birds bring to Northwest Ohio. It's the most joyful thing to step out there and see these birds and see people unified by their love, a common love of anything these days. And so take someone new birding, share that joy. It's the greatest gift that I will ever give anyone, that connection to birds and nature. And I want to thank you all again for coming in on a beautiful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you to each of our speakers. That was wonderful. I could say these are hot commodities. These will be also in the 6 Windows on Wildlife in the Metroparks as soon as I get them there, probably this weekend. We had a few questions come in, but I know we're running short on time. But one I did want to ask from somebody in the audience had to do with backyard bird feeding. Does feeding birds help in bird conservation? Does it hurt? I'll let you all address that.
I guess I can take that. Yeah, so bird feeding is, a lot of people struggle with that sometimes. My take on it, and I've seen a couple of scientific presentations on this recently as well, is that as much as possible, try and avoid just feeding introduced and invasive species. So a lot of times we end up with starlings and house sparrows at feeders. So one thing that we want to kind of discourage is trying to let those birds kind of get the upper hand over our native species. So I think it's fine to feed birds during the winter, especially. We have birds that are overwintering here, especially when there's a lot of snow on the ground or when it's really cold. They can struggle to find food. One thing to keep in mind is if you start feeding birds in the winter, it's best to keep doing it, and especially don't stop when there's a big snowfall or a big freeze, because those birds have kind of become reliant on your feeders. So I think if you feed responsibly, try and avoid just feeding the invasive species. There's nothing wrong with it, and it certainly brings a lot of joy. We have feeders right outside my office, and it's awesome. I love it. So yeah, that's my general take on that.
Thank you.
I'll just add that bird feeders are the perfect way to introduce someone new to birding. Go out to Secord Metropark or Pearson and visit the Windows on Wildlife. It's comfortable. People can enjoy watching the birds coming to the feeders. You can see them up close, and so it's a great way to introduce people to birds.
Thank you. A couple other questions. Somebody asked how or is bird health related to human health? Do we have any research on that?
Well, there are zoonotic diseases that birds and people can pass back and forth to each other. I mean, obviously avian influenza is the big issue at the moment. And this year we had a lot of avian influenza in the United States. Thankfully it wasn't one that was easily passed to people. So it is important that you kind of keep that in mind when you're out amongst birds, that you do wash your hands, especially if you pick up a dead bird.
And I think probably the last question we have time for, but one of our raptor monitors at Metroparks who says she's been collecting data for 18 years and has never seen a sharp-shinned hawk nest. Is this because they're hard to find or because their numbers are down here? Anybody, any raptor experts there?
I'm pretty sure that we just don't really have many sharp-shinned hawks that nest here. Yeah, from what I've seen and what I can recall looking at eBird and things, I think we really just have them mostly during migration and during the winter, and that we're just not in like a major part of their breeding range. Mm-hmm. Is that okay? Yeah.
And Kim, you touched on the wind turbines. Are the large number of wind turbines on the Canadian side of Lake Erie affecting migration that you know of?
Well, unfortunately, I think it is contributing to that overall decline that Jay mentioned, but there's no standardization of studies across the country. There are no regulations. So the industry basically can determine how they want to monitor wind turbines for bird kills. And even in the state of Ohio, the Bird Observatory had to file a Freedom of Information Act request to get the data of the turbines that are in the western part of Ohio, and they went to court to prevent us from getting any numbers, and they won. So the public really can't even determine the exact number of birds because that data is generally hidden.
Thank you. Thank all of you. I was hoping we would end with a glorious sunset like we've had the last few nights. That would just be the icing on the cake, but not tonight. The next Sustaining Our World speaker series is scheduled for June 13th, so watch for an announcement on that. A couple other quick announcements. If you grab one of Meredith's business cards over here, we have a Glass City cleanup with Dana on April 20th, which is also part of this series and Dana's gift to the Riverwalk. We have these periodic cleanups involving some of Dana's employees, Metroparks volunteers, and people from the community. Watch too for the City Nature Challenge coming up April 28th through May 2nd. And finally, it might interest some in this room, we have Metroparks has a Kirtland's Warbler Eco Tour May 22nd through 24th up the road in Michigan. It sounds like they've put together a phenomenal experience for everybody. You can pick up flyers for that over here. And with that, thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a chance to spend some of this beautiful weather out in the Metroparks. Take care.